Welcome to the new episode of History of Revolution. How are you? Hope your week was fine.
Doing well, thanks. Ready to get into it. Today, we're really jumping straight into, well, a pretty critical but maybe often overlooked analysis of global conflict.
Yeah, we're taking a deep dive specifically into the Marxist understanding of World War II.
And for you, the learner, our aim here is to move, way beyond the usual story, the standard narrative of just good versus evil.
Right, we want to look underneath that to expose the underlying economic forces, the deep contradictions that are inherent in the capitalist system.
Contradictions that Marxists argue made these huge global conflicts not just like accidents of history,
Right.
but actually inevitable.
That word inevitable, it really hits hard, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It suggests the war wasn't just a failure of diplomacy or, the fault of a few bad leaders.
Exactly. It suggests it was the logical endpoint, the result of an economic machine running precisely as it was, well, designed to run.
And our main sources for digging into this are some really foundational texts. We've got Vladimir Lenin's famous 1917 work, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, super key for understanding the 20th century.
Definitely. And we're combining that with analysis from people like Leon Trotsky and also more contemporary Marxist historians like Donnie Gluckstein.
Lenin's take on World War I was, well, pretty blunt. He called it an annexationist, predatory, plunderous war.
Brutal, yeah. And our mission today is really to see how that exact perspective applies to the war from 1939 to 1945, not just as like a repeat performance of World War I.
But as the inevitable outcome of this global capitalist system hitting its highest and most contradictory stage.
So to really get the war, we first need to lay down the economic foundation that Lenin described.
Okay, so first things first, we need to really grasp what Lenin actually meant by imperialism, because he wasn't talking about, say, the Roman Empire or the old British Empire in quite the same way.
Right. He defined imperialism as a new stage, a specific advanced stage of capitalism itself, which he argued really took hold around the turn of the 20th century.
And this idea didn't just appear out of nowhere, did it? It was built on earlier work.
Absolutely. It was a synthesis. Lenin drew quite heavily on the economist John A. Hobson. Hobson studied how capitalism used expanding overseas to sort of, well, solve its problems back home.
Okay.
And also Rudolf Hilferding. His big work was finance capital, and it looked at the huge new role banks were playing in industry.
So Lenin kind of connected the dots.
Yeah, he argued these new economic features weren't just like random policies. They were products of how capitalism had to develop, part of its internal logic.
That distinction feels important. It's not just saying capitalists are greedy people.
No, it's saying the system itself, its internal laws, dictates this kind of behavior. And this shift, this transition to what we call monopoly capitalism or imperialism, Lenin defined it by 5 basic features. They're all interconnected.
Right. And if we get these 5, we get the economic root of the world wars.
Pretty much.
Okay, let's slow down then and maybe unpack these one by one. The first feature is the concentration of production and the rise of monopolies.
Right. So early capitalism, is much more competitive. Lots of smaller companies, medium-sized firms, all fighting it out for market share.
The classic image.
Exactly. But as the system matures, competition itself naturally leads to concentration. It just happens.
How so?
Well, the bigger companies, or the more successful ones, the more efficient ones, they just swallow up the smaller, weaker ones, or drive them out of business.
Okay.
So production gets centralized. It ends up in the hands of just a few massive entities. Think cartels, trusts, syndicates, these huge operations that come to dominate entire markets.
And this move from competition to monopoly, that changes everything.
Fundamentally, it's a huge shift. Because when you have a monopoly, you control the prices, right? You control supply.
Yeah.
Those old competitive pressures that used to drive down costs, they kind of disappear. And the rise of these giant corporations, like the big steel or oil trusts back in the early 1900s, that really signals the start of this modern imperialist era. And it leads straight to the rise of what Lenin called finance capital.
Which takes us nicely to the second feature.
Yeah.
The banks and their new role.
Yeah. So as production gets concentrated in fewer hands, capital itself concentrates too, all that money.
Right.
And the banks, which, historically were mostly just intermediaries taking deposits, giving out loans, suddenly they're sitting on these immense centralized pools of cash.
Okay.
And Lenin explains they stop being just passive pipes for money. They start taking a direct, active role. They exert control over the industries they lend money to.
How do they do that?
They put their own people on the boards of directors. They demand certain business policies. Their influence starts to creep into every corner of industrial life. The banker and the industrialist, they effectively become the same person, or at least their interests merge completely.
And this merging, this is the third feature, the one you called finance capital and the financial oligarchy.
Exactly. And this one is maybe the most abstract, but it's incredibly powerful in Lenin's theory.
Okay, break it down for us.
Yeah.
Because finance capital sounds a bit dense.
Right. So you have industrial capital, that's the actual means of production, the factories, the railways, the machines, all that stuff.
Got it.
And you have banking capital, this massive centralized cash reserves you just talked about. When these two merge, like inextricably, they become completely intertwined. You get this new hybrid thing, finance capital.
So it's not just a big bank lending money to a factory, it's deeper than that.
Much deeper. It's a complete integration. Think of it like this. The bank uses its financial power to discipline the industry, maybe decide which projects get funded, which companies survive. And the industry uses its profits to swell the bank's power, allowing it to control even more.
And this creates an oligarchy.
Yes, a financial oligarchy. This process gives rise to this really powerful, small, super rich group. And they don't just control the national economy anymore, they start exerting overwhelming influence over the government too.
Why the...
Because for this oligarchy, global policy, national policy, it's just an extension of their private financial interests. They need the state to help them secure foreign markets, protect their overseas investments, get access to resources. Politics becomes finance conducted by other means, essentially.
Okay, I think I'm following. So this oligarchy forms, they concentrate capital at home,
Yeah.
but then they hit a problem,
Mm-hmm.
which is the fourth feature.
Spot on. The fourth feature is the export of capital. They've generated enormous wealth, mountains of capital, but the home market, the domestic market, inevitably gets saturated.
Saturated how?
Well, the concentration of capital also leads to overproduction. They can produce far more goods than the domestic working class, whose wages are kept low, can actually afford to buy.
Right, and that leaves them with...
Surplus capital, money that needs to be invested somewhere to make a profit. But if they invest it all domestically, in that saturated market, the rate of profit will inevitably fall. There's just too much capital chasing too few profitable opportunities at home.
So where does it go?
It has to be exported. It flows out to less developed countries, colonies, semi-colonies, places where returns are much higher.
Why are returns higher there?
Several reasons. Resources are often cheaper, sometimes basically free for the taking, but crucially, labor is much, much cheaper. So the profits you can make are exponentially higher than back home.
And this export of capital, that's what Lenin defines as modern imperialism.
Yes, that's the core of it. Powerful countries driven by the needs of their financial oligarchy, needing to control and exploit weaker countries directly to guarantee those super profits from exported capital.
And this connects to an argument you hear sometimes, the labor aristocracy.
Absolutely. The concept of the labor aristocracy is really important for understanding why, perhaps, revolution doesn't happen sooner in the main imperialist countries.
How does that work?
Well, these massive super profits that are generated from exploiting the colonies, a small portion of that gets siphoned off. It's used back home to essentially buy off a certain segment of the working class.
Which segment?
Usually the more skilled workers, maybe union leaders, what Lenin called an upper stratum. They get slightly better wages, maybe some social welfare benefits funded by colonial profits, or even just the security of knowing their job isn't immediately going overseas.
So this upper layer is kept relatively happy.
Or at least politically complacent. They benefit, even if indirectly and only marginally, from the whole system of colonial exploitation. So they're less likely to push for radical change, for revolution, against a system that seems to provide them with some stability.
It's like the oligarchy uses a tiny slice of the colonial pie to bribe a part of its own working class.
That's a good way to put it. It allows the ruling class to buy social peace at home, to diffuse revolutionary tension funded by exploitation abroad.
Which brings us to the fifth and final feature of imperialism.
Right, the division of the world. This relentless search for guaranteed resources, guaranteed markets, guaranteed places to invest that surplus capital. It naturally drives these global monopolies and the states they control to divide the entire world up into spheres of influence, into colonies.
Carving up the globe.
Literally, Lenin points out that the period roughly between 1876 and 1900 saw what he called the final partition of the world. By 1900, pretty much every territory on Earth was claimed by one imperialist power or another. There was nothing left unclaimed to grab easily.
But this division, it wasn't stable, was it? You mentioned a structural fault line.
Exactly, because while the map was carved up, the economic power underneath was constantly shifting. In the late 19th, early 20th century, you had the old guard empires, Britain and France, holding these vast colonial possessions, huge territories.
Right.
But then you had newer capitalist powers rising fast, Germany particularly, Japan too. They arrived late to the colonial party, so to speak.
So Germany's economy is booming, maybe even surpassing Britain's in some areas.
Right. Industrially, technologically, Germany was becoming a powerhouse. But it lacked the massive global resource base, the captive colonial markets that Britain controlled through its empire.
And that's the contradiction.
That is the critical contradiction, yes.
Yeah.
Economic power is dynamic, it's always changing, Germany's growing fast. But the political map, the control of colonies, is static. It's locked in by the older empire.
And Lenin argued this mismatch, this imbalance.
Must be resolved through force.
Yes.
It's unavoidable. When a rising power like Germany feels its economic strength is being strangled because the older powers control all the essential colonies and markets. War isn't just a policy option. It becomes the inevitable result.
A war for redivision.
Exactly. A violent struggle to recarve the global map, to make the political control match the new economic reality. So the groundwork for World War I, and then, as we'll see, for World War II, was, according to this analysis, built right into the very structure of monopoly capitalism.
Okay, so let's really connect those dots now. If World War I was that first huge struggle for redivision, then World War II, in the Marxist view, wasn't some completely new phenomenon. It wasn't a sudden moral crusade against fascism that just appeared.
No, it was fundamentally the continuation of that same underlying economic struggle. As the historian Chris Bambury argues, WWII was essentially round two, another fight to redivide the world among the great imperialist powers, still battling for global dominance, resources, and markets.
And the specific conditions of the 1930s poured gasoline on that fire, right? The Great Depression.
Oh, absolutely. The Depression acted as this massive catalyst. It massively intensified destructive protectionism.
What do you mean by that?
Well, the major powers, the U.S., Britain, France, they retreated inwards economically. They tried to create these protected trading blocs, sometimes called imperial preference systems, basically trading mostly within their own empires or spheres of influence.
And they could do that because?
Because they had vast empires or huge internal resources. Think about the British Empire, the French Empire, and the sheer continental scale of the United States. They were relatively self-sufficient or could source materials from within their own zones.
Well, what about the others? Germany, Japan, Italy? The ones Lenin called the latecomers?
Exactly. They were strangled by this protectionism. They didn't have the vast overseas territories. They didn't have the internal raw material zones.
So for Germany's massive industrial economy, this global shutdown was a disaster.
Catastrophic. Their recovery after World War I had really relied on exports, on access to global resources. Now, suddenly, they're shut out of key markets. And they have to buy essential raw materials, oil, rubber, iron, ore, using foreign currency they barely had.
So the ruling classes in those countries, Germany, Japan, Italy, they saw only one way out.
Pretty much. From their perspective, the only viable solution to secure guaranteed markets and raw materials was military expansion and conquest.
Which directly fueled the political drive for expansion, like Lebensraum.
Precisely. The demand for Lebensraum, living space, in Eastern Europe for Germany, or Japan's push for a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, these weren't just abstract ideologies. For the German and Japanese business classes who were desperate for profits and resources, conquest was a direct economic necessity. The ideology served that immediate need.
Okay. Now, there was a counter-argument around at the time, wasn't there? From another Marxist thinker, Karl Kautsky, this idea of ultra-imperialism.
Yes, that's important to address. Kautsky wondered if maybe these giant international cartels and monopolies would become so powerful, so integrated across borders, that they might actually lead to a phase of global cooperation.
Cooperation. How?
The idea was maybe the major imperialist powers would unite to jointly exploit the underdeveloped world, sharing the spoils peacefully, which would lessen the contradictions and maybe even prevent future wars.
Could capitalism achieve lasting peace by uniting the big players?
It was a serious question, but Lenin argued very emphatically, no, absolutely not. He countered that finance capital, these global trusts, they actually increase the unevenness in growth rates between different countries.
Why does that prevent cooperation?
Because the economic power balance is always shifting.
Yeah.
While the political map, the colonial divisions might be fixed for a while, the economic engine underneath is constantly changing. Some countries grow faster than others.
Like Germany and Japan, as you mentioned.
Exactly. Lenin pointed out that the relative strength of countries like Germany and Japan was changing dramatically compared to the older empires like Britain and Russia. Because this balance is always in flux, any lasting political cooperation or unity is, as he put it, out of the question.
So every few decades, a newly powerful nation will demand its place in the sun, demand a redivision.
That's the logic. The inherent instability and competition within capitalism itself motivates rivalry and ultimately violent conflict, not lasting cooperation.
And this system doesn't just lead to war, Lenin argued. It also leads to internal problems within the imperialist countries themselves, parasitism and decay.
Yes. He argued that the huge super profits being skimmed off the colonies create a kind of parasitism back home in the advanced nations.
How does that work?
Well, think about it. If you're a giant monopoly and you're making massive guaranteed profits from your colonial investments where labor is cheap and resources are practically free, why would you invest heavily in risky new technology or major efficiency improvements back home?
You wouldn't need to as much.
Right, you can just fix high prices, use your monopoly power, and rake in the profits from abroad. Lenin argued this tendency reduces the incentive for technological progress and innovation in the home country. It leads to stagnation, to decay.
A sign of what he called moribund capitalism.
Exactly. Moribund means dying or decaying. He saw this imperialist stage not as capitalism's strength, but as a symptom of it becoming old, stagnant, reliant on exploiting others rather than dynamic internal growth.
And built on force.
Absolutely. The whole structure, he argued, relies fundamentally on the use of force or threat of use of force to protect private interests, whether it's colonial armies suppressing uprisings or gunboats forcing open markets. Finance capital's global reach, in this view, is ultimately built on violence.
Okay, so while the capitalist world is on this collision course towards another massive war, you have the Soviet Union, this huge non-capitalist state, kind of isolated and surrounded by hostile powers. How did it navigate this?
That's a crucial part of the picture. And here we can turn to Leon Trotsky's analysis, particularly from some interviews he gave around 1940. He really focused on how the Soviet bureaucracy dealt with this impending global conflict.
Trotsky made a distinction there, didn't he, between the Soviet state itself and the bureaucracy running it.
Yes, a critical one. He argued Soviet foreign policy had to be understood through two lenses. First, the objective position of the USSR, a state based on nationalized property, inherently opposed to global finance capital. That's one pressure.
And the second?
The second pressure was the internal position, the vulnerability of the ruling bureaucracy itself, the totalitarian oligarchy in the Kremlin, led by Stalin. Trotsky argued this bureaucracy feared a major war more than any capitalist ruling class did.
Why more? Why were they so afraid?
Because their power wasn't based on owning capital like capitalists. It was based purely on political control over the nationalized economy and the state apparatus. A big military defeat, or even just the massive stress of a total war, could easily spark popular anger, maybe even a political revolution from below that would sweep the bureaucracy away entirely.
They had everything to lose personally.
Exactly. Their privileges, their power, their very existence was tied to maintaining control. War threatened that control directly.
And this deep fear, this internal vulnerability, that helps explain the really shocking development in 1939, the Stalin-Hitler Pact.
Absolutely. Trotsky argued that Stalin desperately wanted that pact to avoid getting dragged immediately into a major European war. He finally got the handshake with Nazi Germany that, as Trotsky put it, he had dreamt unceasingly for 6 years.
So Stalin's goal wasn't alliance, but avoidance. Buying time.
Buying time, precisely. The hope was to let the imperialist powers, Germany, France, Britain, fight each other to exhaustion, while the USSR stayed out and built up its strength.
But it wasn't based on trust, was it? It was pure calculation.
Cold, cynical calculation on both sides. And the sources, like Littstein, really emphasized the secret protocols attached to the pact. The ones that carved up Poland between them. Russia got about 52%, Hitler got 48%.
And Russia also supplied Germany.
Yes. Crucially, the USSR provided Hitler with vital raw materials in the early stages of the war, which helped fuel the German war machine against Britain and France.
But Trotsky argued the Soviet actions, like invading eastern Poland and the Baltic states, were also defensive moves against Hitler.
Paradoxically, yes. The Kremlin saw these invasions as taking material guarantees. Pushing the Soviet border westward created strategic depth. It was done against their supposed ally Hitler because they fully expected him to turn on the USSR eventually. It was about preparing for that inevitable betrayal.
There was also an internal dimension to these annexations, wasn't there? The pact was unpopular at home.
Extremely unpopular. Remember, the Soviet population had been fed years and years of intense anti-fascist propaganda. Suddenly, Stalin allies with Hitler. It was a huge shock.
So the land grabs were partly for show.
Partly to justify the pact internally, taking back territories in western Ukraine and western Belorussia, which had large Ukrainian and Belarusian populations, and getting bases in the Baltics. These were presented as victories, as proof that Stalin's cunning policy was benefiting the Soviet Union, providing tangible gains and a buffer zone.
But this strategic maneuvering hit a major snag almost immediately, didn't it, with the invasion of Finland?
Oh, the Finnish campaign debacle, Winter War. It was a disaster for the Red Army and exposed huge weaknesses.
What wrong?
Pretty much everything. Trotsky details the failures.
Yeah.
Massively underestimating Finnish resistance, completely ignoring the brutal winter conditions and logistical challenges, suffering immense defeats and casualties over 11 weeks.
And Trotsky blamed the leadership.
Directly. He attributed the incompetence to the decapitated and demoralized general staff. Remember, Stalin had conducted massive purges of the Red Army leadership in the late 1930s, killing or imprisoning thousands of experienced officers.
So the commanders left were chosen for loyalty, not skill.
They were appointed for servility rather than for its talent and knowledge, as Trotsky put it. The purges had gutted the army's effectiveness just before a major war.
And the war exposed deeper problems in the Soviet system, too.
Yes, the failures highlighted the inherent flaws of the totalitarian regime. There was chaos in the supply lines, a complete lack of proportion in the economy. They could churn out tanks and planes, maybe. But soldiers lacked basic things like proper sanitation, gloves, and boots.
A disconnect between the planners and reality.
A huge disconnect. Trotsky wrote that the living man who stands behind all machines was completely forgotten by the bureaucracy, and morale was incredibly low, partly because of the tight political control by commissars who often interfered with military decisions and prioritized ideological purity over competence.
And internationally, the invasion was a public relations disaster.
Absolutely. Trotsky raised a really sharp point about this, questioning the whole idea of a socialist state spreading its system by force. He quoted Robespierre, "People do not like missionaries with bayonets."
So invading Finland, even if it had strategic logic for Moscow,
was seen by Finland's neighbors and much of the world not as liberation, but simply as an act of violence. It badly damaged the USSR's reputation and actually made it easier for the imperialist powers, like Britain and France, to mobilize anti-Soviet sentiment.
By the way, if you liked and interested so far, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment. It's really important for us to continue this series.
So things are getting complicated, right?
Yeah.
You have the imperialist powers maneuvering, the Soviet Union playing its own complex game. It leads us to a core idea in the Marxist analysis of WWII, particularly pushed by historians like Donnie Gluckstein.
Which is?
That World War II wasn't really just one war. It was actually two distinct wars, running in parallel, often overlapping, sometimes conflicting, a kind of unity of opposites.
Two wars at the same time. What were they?
Well, on one side, you absolutely have the clear imperialist nature of the Allies. There's no ambiguity there for Marxists. The ruling classes in Britain, France, the U.S. people like Churchill, Roosevelt, they weren't fighting primarily out of some pure anti-fascist principle.
They were fighting for their own interests.
For their own capitalist and imperialist interests. Churchill said it openly, again and again. He was fighting to defend the British Empire against its rivals, Germany and Japan.
And the U.S.
America only entered the war fully when its own vital interests were threatened, as they saw it, at Pearl Harbor. And its main focus quickly became securing its dominance, especially in the Pacific, and globally, financially.
You can see that cynicism quite early on, can't you? With the phony war.
Oh, the phony war is a classic example. Those 7 months after Poland was invaded, when Britain and France basically sat on their hands on the Western Front, doing virtually nothing militarily against Germany.
Why? What was the thinking?
Well, some historians, looking at the sources from the time, argue pretty convincingly that the Western Allies were, in effect, waiting, hoping hoping that Hitler would turn east and attack the Soviet Union.
Let the Nazis and the communists destroy each other.
That seems to have been the calculation for some. Let the two rival systems bleed each other dry while the Western empires watch from the sidelines.
And there's that other incredible detail about bombing factories.
Right. The story that the British Air Minister was hesitant to bomb German armament factories because they were private property? I mean, if true, that just perfectly captures the priorities, doesn't it?
Protecting capital, even enemy capital, over potentially shortening the war.
It underscores that for the ruling class, this was fundamentally a war between rival economic systems, rival imperialisms, not just a simple moral crusade against evil.
Okay, so that's the imperialist war. What was the other war running alongside it?
That's what Gluckstein calls the People's War. This was the struggle that came from below. It ran parallel to the inter-imperialist conflict, but it had very different motivations.
Motivations like?
Genuine anti-fascism, yes, but also anti-imperialism in general, and often demands for really radical social change. This was the war fought by the resistance movements.
Not partisans.
Exactly. The anti-Nazi resistance across occupied Europe. Think of the communist-led Emilas in Greece, which became massive, or Tito's partisans in Yugoslavia.
And outside Europe, too.
Definitely.
Right.
The anti-imperialist struggles against the Japanese, but also against the allied colonial powers, the French in Vietnam, the British in India, the Dutch in Indonesia. These movements were fighting for national liberation, for land reform, sometimes explicitly for socialism or people's power.
Goals that were very different from Churchill's or Roosevelt's goals.
Radically different. And the theorist Ernest Mandel offered a useful way to synthesize this. He suggested WWII was actually a complex combination of maybe 5 different types of war happening simultaneously.
5. What were they?
You had the main inter-imperialist war axis versus allies. You had the defensive war of the USSR after Hitler invaded it. You had national liberation wars against colonialism, especially in China and across Asia and Africa. And you had specific popular liberation wars against Nazi occupation, like in Yugoslavia and Greece, which had a strong social revolutionary element.
So it's complicated, but the key point is the contradiction.
That's the crucial takeaway. The People's War and the Imperialist War were fundamentally opposites in their aims, even though they temporarily shared a common enemy in the Axis powers.
How so? Opposites.
The masses, the resistance fighters, they were fighting against Axis imperialism and often for a fundamentally different, better world. The Allied governments, however, were fighting to defend or expand their own imperialism against a rival imperialism. Their goals clashed.
So the fighters in, say, the Italian resistance aiming for a Red Italy
had a completely different motivation and goal than Churchill, who wanted to restore the Italian monarchy, or Stalin, who had his own geopolitical plans. They were allies of convenience against Hitler, but their ultimate aims were irreconcilable.
Hey, listener, do you have any other idea or question about this? Please write in comments.
Yeah, it's a complex picture. This dual war perspective helps us appreciate the heroism and the revolutionary aspirations within the resistance, while still keeping hold of that core Marxist analysis that the war's ultimate driver was the crisis of capitalism and the clash of empires.
Okay, to really hammer home this point about the Allies' own imperialist nature, maybe we should look at some specific actions. Actions taken by the so-called democratic Allies, especially outside Europe, during the war itself.
Yes, because if you look at how they operated in the colonies, the continuity of exploitation even during an anti-fascist war is stark. It really challenges the narrative.
And one of the most horrifying examples has to be the Bengal famine in 1943.
It's absolutely devastating. We're talking about British-controlled India. Estimates range from 1.5 million up to maybe 3.5 million deaths. And the crucial point is this wasn't primarily a natural disaster like a drought.
It was man-made.
Largely, yes. A direct consequence of British imperial policy during wartime. The sources are quite clear on this. The British authorities were systematically stockpiling huge amounts of food grain for the Indian Army, which was fighting for Britain.
Okay.
And they were also exporting rice from Bengal rice needed by the local population to feed British soldiers fighting elsewhere, like in the Middle East. This happened even though the local harvest in Bengal itself was actually reasonably good that year.
So the food was there, but it was taken.
It was prioritized for the military and for export over the needs of the Bengali civilians. And the tragedy was made even worse by decisions coming directly from the top, from Winston Churchill himself.
What did Churchill do?
The viceroy in India, Lord Wavell, saw the unfolding catastrophe and desperately pleaded with London to send grain shipments. His requests were repeatedly rejected.
Rejected.
The sources indicate Churchill actually specifically intervened to block provision of 10,000 tons of grain offered by Canada. There are reports suggesting he saw sending food aid as appeasement of the Indian National Congress Party, which was demanding independence.
Appeasement. Millions were dying.
The cold logic of empire. Maintaining political control, prosecuting the war effort as they defined it, took precedence over preventing mass starvation in a colony. It's a brutal illustration of imperial priorities.
And this wasn't just a British thing, was it? Other allies acted similarly.
No, sadly not. You see similar patterns with French colonial exploitation continuing right through the war. Take the Tonkin famine in Vietnam in 1945.
Vietnam was under French control then, even Free French.
Yes, nominally under the Free French government fighting alongside the Allies. Yet this famine killed up to 2 million Vietnamese people. And again, it wasn't just neglect.
What happened?
Far from bringing aid, the French colonial army was actively shipping huge quantities of rice, 10 or more boatloads a day, out of the famine-stricken area.
Shipping rice out of a famine zone.
Yes. Again, the priority was maintaining colonial control, supplying French forces, extracting resources for the war effort, regardless of the cost to the local population. It shows the banner of anti-fascism didn't change the fundamental nature of colonial rule.
Beyond this direct economic exploitation, there was also a political pattern, wasn't there? The Allies often seemed to prefer reactionaries over actual anti-fascists on the ground.
That's another critical point. Look at Greece right after the Nazi occupation collapsed in late 1944.
What happened there?
The main resistance force, the one that had done most of the fighting against the Nazis, was the communist-led Imperialism. They effectively controlled most of the country when the Germans left.
So liberation.
You'd think. But Churchill's response was immediate and hostile. He saw Imperialism not as allies, but as a threat, a left-wing, potentially revolutionary force. He immediately dispatched British troops.
To help rebuild.
No, to suppress the resistance. He gave his commander, General Scobie, incredibly blunt orders. He told him to act as if you were in a conquered city where a local rebellion is in progress.
Against the very people who fought the Nazis.
Exactly. It makes it crystal clear. The primary objective for Britain wasn't liberating Greece for the Greeks. It was preventing a left-wing government from taking power, ensuring Greece remained within the British sphere of influence, and restoring the old order, including the unpopular monarchy, containing revolution trumped celebrating liberation.
And this wasn't just Greece. This happened elsewhere in Europe.
It was a widespread pattern as Allied armies advanced. When Germany finally capitulated, Allied military governments across Europe consistently chose to cooperate with old guard figures, former Nazi Party members in low-level admin roles, Vichy officials in France, Italian fascists who switched sides late rather than hand power over to the genuinely anti-fascist resistance committees that had sprung up everywhere.
The Antifas.
Yes, the Antifa, the local anti-fascist committees. There are accounts from ordinary soldiers, like one American GI quoted in the sources, noting how U.S. forces would often free arrested collaborators and put them back into positions of local authority while pushing aside the resistance leaders who had actually fought fascism.
Why would they do that?
Because the ultimate goal for the Allied ruling classes wasn't radical change. It was stability. It was restoring the pre-war capitalist order, or a version of it they could control. Left-wing resistance movements, with their demands for social change, were seen as a bigger long-term threat than low-level collaborators who could be relied upon to maintain order.
So the war started as an inter-imperialist fight, and it ended with a new imperialist order, dominated by the U.S.
That's exactly how the Marxist analysis sees it. The war fundamentally reshuffled the deck, leading to the overwhelming financial hegemony of the United States. The U.S. didn't just stumble into this position, it actively used the war to achieve it.
How did they leverage the war?
Well, they deliberately set out to dismantle the existing imperial trade blocs of their rivals, especially the British and French empires. They wanted a post-war world of open doors open, that is, for American capital and goods to dominate.
What about Lend-Lease? Wasn't that selfless aid?
It's often presented that way, but the reality was far more transactional. Lend-Lease came with very strict conditions attached. Britain, for instance, was explicitly barred from using Lend-Lease materials to manufacture goods for export to new markets that would compete with U.S. exports.
Really?
Yes. And crucially, Britain was forced to pledge that after the war, it would dissolve the sterling bloc, the system of preferential trade within its empire. This was the U.S. using its financial leverage to break open Britain's protected imperial market for American corporations.
So less charity, more strategic economic warfare against an ally.
You could definitely argue that. The sources even talk about the U.S. systematically fleecing Britain during the war. There's a stark example from late 1940.
What happened?
Apparently, the U.S. sent a warship down to South Africa and basically seized 50 million pounds worth of gold that Britain had stored there, pretty much Britain's last significant tangible asset as payment assurance for war supplies. They didn't even notify London beforehand. It shows the ruthless pursuit of national economic interest, even between allies. The U.S. was ensuring it came out of the war not just victorious, but financially dominant over everyone else, including its partners.
It really puts that quote from Harry Truman into perspective, doesn't it? The one from before the U.S. even entered the war.
Ah, yes, the infamous Truman quote. It's chillingly blunt about the cold, strategic calculus involved. He said, basically, if we see that Germany is winning, we ought to help Russia, and if Russia is winning, we ought to help Germany, and that way let them kill as many as possible.
Just let your potential rivals destroy each other.
Exactly. The goal wasn't primarily about ideology, democracy, or freedom. It was about strategically weakening all potential rivals, ensuring America emerged as the undisputed global hegemon after the conflict.
Okay, so we've painted a picture of Allied imperialism running right through the war. But obviously, the war did have huge consequences. Fascism was defeated. There were real turning points driven by, well, not just cynical calculation.
Absolutely. And you cannot talk about the turning points without talking about the Eastern Front, and specifically the Battle of Stalingrad.
Which ended in early 1943.
Right. And it was recognized almost immediately worldwide as the absolute turning point. Mao Zedong wrote an analysis of it around October 1942 while it was still raging, calling it potentially the turning point in the history of all mankind.
Why did he see it as so decisive?
Well, Hitler had thrown enormous forces into capturing Stalingrad and reaching the Caucasus oil fields. It was a massive gamble to secure the resources Germany desperately needed to continue the war long term. Mao called it Hitler's last desperate struggle.
And the Red Army stopping them there.
Completely foiled that plan. It forced Hitler onto the strategic defensive on the Eastern Front, from which the Nazis never really recovered. And as Mao argued, for a fascist state which builds its entire political and military identity on aggression, on taking the offensive, being forced onto the defensive is fatal.
It breaks the momentum.
It breaks the momentum, and it signals the inevitable end. Stalingrad didn't just stop the Germans, it fundamentally shifted the entire strategic balance of the war globally. Mao predicted Hitler would now face attack from three powerful foes: the relentless Red Army advance, the eventual Second Front from the Western Allies, and, importantly, the rising tide of people's uprisings in occupied Europe.
And the Soviet victory at Stalingrad and their overall success in pushing back the Nazis, Marxists attribute that to something specific, despite Stalin's regime.
Yes. Despite the horrific purges, despite the crimes of the Stalinist bureaucracy, the sources are generally clear on this point. The USSR managed to inflict that shattering defeat on what was arguably the most powerful military machine ever assembled at that time, primarily because of the underlying strength of its nationalized planned economy.
The planned economy.
How did that help? In a situation of total war, the ability to centrally plan and direct all national resources, industry, labor, materials towards the single goal of military production gave the USSR a crucial advantage. It could mobilize resources on a scale and with a speed that the more decentralized, sometimes chaotic, capitalist economies of the Axis powers struggled to match, especially over the long haul.
So it could outproduce the Nazis.
Ultimately, yes. It demonstrated the immense productive power that could be unleashed when industry wasn't driven solely by private profit, but by state planning for a national objective. Even a bureaucratically distorted planned economy, as Marxists saw it, proved superior in mobilizing for total war compared to Nazi Germany's privately owned, state-directed capitalism.
Okay, so bringing this all together, what's the final Marxist takeaway on the significance of World War II?
Fascism was defeated, which was good.
Undeniably. The destruction of the fascist regimes in Germany, Italy, and Japan was a massive objective victory for the international working class, for oppressed peoples everywhere. That's not in question.
But the fundamentally imperialist nature of the war, particularly as waged by the Western Allies, meant that the immense revolutionary potential that had built up during the war was largely contained, suppressed, or channeled into outcomes acceptable to the victors.
The potential of the resistance movements you mentioned.
Exactly. Those movements across Europe, in Greece, Italy, France, Yugoslavia, many of them were fighting not just against fascism, but for genuine people's power, for socialist transformation. That potential, that revolutionary energy was, as some historians put it, ultimately squandered and crushed
Crushed by whom?
by the actions of the victorious Allied leaders, Churchill, Roosevelt, and also Stalin, who had his own interests in preventing independent revolutions outside his control. They worked, often together despite their other rivalries, to restore capitalist order in Western Europe, or to establish regimes subservient to Moscow in the East.
So the war ended fascism, but it didn't end the system that produced it.
Precisely. They prioritized containing any left-wing upheaval over allowing genuine popular liberation that might challenge their own power or the capitalist system itself. So, while fascism was defeated on the battlefield, the underlying contradictions of monopoly capitalism and imperialism, the very forces Lenin identified as the root cause of the war, remained fundamentally unresolved. The stage was simply set for the next phase of inter-imperialist conflict, the Cold War. #outro.
Right. So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've unpacked Lenin's core ideas about imperialism, how monopoly capitalism leads inevitably to exporting finance capital, dividing up the world, rivalry, and ultimately war.
And we've seen how, according to this Marxist analysis, World War II, despite having this crucial anti-fascist dimension driven by the masses, was at its core an inter-imperialist conflict, a continuation of the struggle for global dominance.
Where the Allied powers, the democracies, repeatedly acted to defend their own capitalist systems, their own colonial interests, sometimes brutally, often at the direct expense of the very people they claimed they were liberating.
Yeah, and maybe the most, well, provocative thought to leave you with, the listener, is how relevant these dynamics might still be. Some analysts, like Ho-Fung Hung, look at the modern rivalry between the US and China,
Okay.
and they see echoes of exactly what Lenin described. You have both powers competing fiercely, using finance lending capital, investing in infrastructure in developing countries to lock those countries into their specific economic spheres, their supply chains, their geopolitical influence.
So it's like the competition between Britain and Germany
Right.
over building railways and gaining influence in the Ottoman Empire or China back in Lenin's day.
The parallels are striking, aren't they? It suggests that the underlying economic structure of global capitalism, the pressures of capital accumulation and interstate competition that fueled the great wars of the 20th century, well, they haven't gone away.
They remain active, potentially just as volatile today. A pretty sobering reminder that history isn't always just about the flags and the speeches you hear.
It's nearly always about the economics, about class interests, about who controls the capital. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the economic engines driving global conflict.
Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment. See you on next episode, comrades. Bye-bye.